broke in smoke and silence. At 9:42 a.m., the 13th of July 1944, Sergeant Curtis Grubb Cullen watched General Omar Bradley step from a dust-choked jeep near Saint-Lô. The wind carried the smell of burnt oil and damp soil. Tank tracks groaned in the distance. Behind them, the fields looked peaceful rows of hedges, apple trees, sunken lanes, but every line of green hid a graveyard. For 6 weeks, the 1st U.S. Army had fought to move 8 miles inland from the beaches. 400 Sherman tanks already lay burned out in those hedgerow traps. Crews roasted before they could climb out. The official reports called them immobilizations. The men called them coffins. No map had warned of the bocage those ancient Norman hedge walls built before Columbus ever sailed. Each was a fortress, 12 feet high, 4 feet thick, earth packed over centuries, ribbed by the roots of oaks and elms. French farmers had piled stones along their boundaries in the Middle Ages. Generations of rain had filled the gaps with dirt until the countryside turned into a maze of green ramparts. From the sky, it looked like farmland. On the ground, it was a labyrinth of death. When a Sherman tried to climb a hedge, its front rose like a horse rearing. The thin 1-inch belly armor lifted into German sights. Panzerfaust teams waited for that angle, the bright underskin of American steel. One rocket, one flash, and the crew inside burned alive. The fields of Normandy devoured tank after tank with medieval patience. Cullen had watched it happen too many times. 29 years old, commander of a scout vehicle in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, he'd spent June crawling through those walls, marking lanes that led nowhere. He'd seen drivers panic, ramming full throttle into the earth. He'd seen dozer tanks try to carve through, their blades catching fire under anti-tank shells. Every tactic failed. Every field took blood. The generals argued in tents lit by flashlights and cigarette smoke. Engineers packed explosives into hedge bases only to blow shallow craters that invited artillery fire. Some units welded spare track links across the hull for extra protection. It helped against bullets, not rockets. By early July, the First Army had advanced less than 9 miles. At that pace, the breakout from Normandy would take 6 months. Operation Cobra, the grand plan to free the army into open French country, was turning into a siege against dirt. Bradley stepped through the mud that morning, coat unbuttoned, eyes hidden behind wire-rimmed glasses. The man looked carved from the same steel he commanded. His officers whispered that the boss was looking for miracles now. What he found instead was a sergeant with burns on his hands and a sketch on a ration box. Cullen stood beside a light tank, coated in soot. The machine looked mutilated, its bow welded with jagged prongs of steel, 4 spears pointing forward at a 35-degree angle. The metal still carried the salt smell of the beach. Bradley stopped. "What in hell is this?" Cullen wiped sweat and ash from his face. "Sir, it's something that eats hedges." He said it quietly, almost apologetically, like a man confessing madness. 2 weeks earlier, he'd scavenged German beach obstacles, the twisted X-shaped Czech hedgehogs that had once ripped American landing craft open on D-Day. Engineers had cut them apart and stacked the pieces in piles of rust. To everyone else, they were junk. To Cullen, they were raw material. He'd taken 4 beams, each 2 inches thick, welded them to the front plate of a light tank, angled down like tusks. The idea was simple. Instead of climbing over a hedgerow, the tank would stab through it. The teeth would bite at the base, where roots were weakest. No rise, no exposed belly. Just forward momentum, brutal, low, unstoppable. He had tested it 7 times on soft ground, 7 clean breaches. But those were light tanks, 15 tons each. A Sherman weighed 33. Twice the impact force, twice the risk. The welds could shear, the tank could flip, the whole experiment could end with fire and wreckage. Yet here they were, standing before General Bradley, the man who commanded 500,000 soldiers, watching an unapproved device built from enemy scrap. Bradley said nothing for several seconds. Then, "Show me." Lieutenant Charles Green from the 747th Tank Battalion climbed into his Sherman. His crew sealed the turret. The tank's engine coughed, then roared. The ground trembled. Dust rose around the treads like smoke from a forge. Cullen stepped back, heart thudding like a piston. He had spent 2 weeks welding in the dark, feeding on adrenaline and coffee. Now 30 seconds would decide whether anyone lived through the next offensive. Bradley raised his binoculars. Proceed. The Sherman lurched forward, gears snarling. 20 yards, 40. The speed rose 25 miles an hour, too fast, too loud. The 4 steel prongs struck the hedgerow with a sound that split the air, a freight train collision of man and earth. Dirt erupted skyward, roots cracked like bones. For 3 long seconds the tank shuddered against the wall, treads spinning, engines screaming. Then, with a roar that silenced every bird in the valley, the hedgerow collapsed inward. The tank burst through, trailing a river of dust and victory. Bradley lowered his binoculars. He walked to the gap. He touched the torn soil, the severed roots still dripping sap, then turned to his staff. His voice was flat but final. "How many of these can we build?" Major General Leonard Guerreau glanced at Cullen. "From beach obstacles, sir. Maybe 500. Bradley nodded once. "I want 3,000. The order cut through the command tent that night like artillery. Every available welder in Normandy, every torch, every hammer would work in 24-hour shifts. Every German obstacle between Cherbourg and the beaches would be stripped for steel. The goal: fit 3,000 tanks with the Cullen device before Operation Cobra on July 25, 12 days away. Outside, the rain started again, thin, metallic. Cullen stood under it, staring at his blackened hands. The sparks that had burned him 2 weeks ago were still visible as red scars. He didn't feel heroic, he felt terrified. If it failed, if the prongs bent or the welds tore, those crews would die inside fields they'd never escape. But if it worked, it could save thousands. That night he walked through the makeshift production field at Colombiers. Stacks of German steel glistened under floodlights. Men hauled torches, dragged hoses, shouted over the hiss of gas. Sparks fell like orange rain. It wasn't a factory, it was a forge of desperation. Every cut of steel was a bet against time, every weld a prayer. Someone asked what they should call the invention. Cullen shrugged. "Just a cutter." A corporal nearby laughed. "Looks like a damn Rhino." The name stuck. In the days that followed, Normandy itself seemed to watch them. The air smelled of diesel and death. Farmers returned to ruined villages, their stone barns shredded by shellfire. Soldiers slept in ditches beside tanks waiting for their new armor. Above it all, the hedgerows stood unchanged green walls indifferent to history. The official statistics came across the wires each morning. 70 tanks per battalion. 4 bulldozer tanks available. Average advance, 1 mile every 5 days. Numbers that translated to body counts. Somewhere between those numbers lived the hope that the Rhino might turn the tide. Cullen didn't think in strategy or doctrine, he thought in faces, the faces of crews burned alive inside metal shells, of gunners who never made it to the hatch. He remembered pulling a half-melted helmet from the mud. That memory welded itself to him as firmly as any piece of steel. On July 14th, the first welders arrived, 30 men from the 52nd Ordnance Group under Captain James Doherty. They set up cutting torches beside shattered orchards, their sparks lighting the fog. The German steel was harder than anything they'd worked with. Torch tips overheated, melted, died. By midnight, only 8 devices were finished, 8 out of 3,000. At that rate, the operation would launch in October. The offensive was scheduled in 12 days. Cullen refused to sleep. He studied torch patterns, calculated cooling times, rewired generators. By dawn, he had reorganized the teams, 1 group cutting, 1 cooling, 1 welding. Output doubled, then tripled. Still not enough. He begged for more welders, more torches, more hours. The army gave him what it could, 40 extra men, crates of acetylene, and silence. From the hills above Saint-Lô, German spotters saw nothing unusual, just flickers of light in the night, like ghosts working the fields. They didn't know an army was arming its tanks with tusks. Meanwhile, the men at the front kept dying. Reports from the 29th Infantry spoke of hedgerows impregnable by reason of antiquity. One officer wrote, "We are fighting geography itself." And that was true. The bocage didn't bleed, didn't surrender, didn't burn. It simply waited for the next column to approach, then swallowed it. That's what made Cullen's idea almost blasphemous. He wasn't inventing a weapon. He was rewriting the relationship between man and earth. To push through the bocage was to defy centuries of nature and tradition in a single mechanical thrust. When word of the demonstration spread through the divisions, skepticism turned to urgency. Every tanker wanted the Rhino. Every mechanic wanted to help build it. The rumor carried faster than official memos. A sergeant cracked the walls of Normandy. In the taverns of Carentan and Isigny, men repeated the story between shell bursts. He welded German steel to a Sherman and drove straight through a hedge. Bullshit. Bradley saw it himself. Then silence. A long drag of a cigarette. Maybe we get out of this after all. By July 16th, the fields around Colombières glowed at night like a city of fireflies. Generators roared. The smell of hot flux and sweat hung heavy. Cullen moved from tank to tank, checking weld seams with the back of his hand, feeling for weakness. His voice rasped from shouting over the noise. Check the brackets, no cracks. Reinforce the bow frame if it bends. He had become part engineer, part preacher, feeding the men with belief as much as orders. And belief was fuel. It kept them cutting, grinding, hammering, fed by belief, dragged by exhaustion. By the time the 12th device rolled off the line, even the skeptics admitted they were watching something extraordinary. Each tank that left the field bore its 4 tusks like a prehistoric beast reborn from mud. Soldiers passing by would stop, stare, and whisper, "Looks ridiculous. Looks unstoppable." Cullen didn't care what it looked like. He cared that it worked. That night he sat alone on the hood of a jeep. The sky faintly red from distant artillery. The hedgerows loomed ahead, black silhouettes against the glow. Somewhere beyond those walls, German gunners were loading shells, waiting for the next American mistake. Cullen thought of the men who would drive these modified tanks, boys from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, farmhands from Kansas. He thought of their letters home, folded inside uniform pockets, waiting to be read again or burned with them. He looked down at his hands, cut, blistered, stained with grease, and wondered if anything built in this field of mud could really save them. The answer waited in the days to come. For now, there was only the hiss of torches, the drag of boots through mud, and the hum of tanks lined up like silent prayers. 12 days remained before Operation Cobra. 12 days to arm an army with faith made of steel. And in that grey corner of Normandy, under clouds that smelled of cordite and rain, the first chapter of deliverance began, not with generals or speeches, but with a sergeant, a welding torch, and the stubborn idea that even the walls of the earth could be cut. Night in Normandy came without stars. Smoke hung low, hugging the fields like an old enemy refusing to leave. In the distance, artillery pulsed against the horizon, slow, steady, like a giant breathing. And under that sky, in a makeshift field near Colombières, men turned wreckage into weapons. Sparks hissed through the dark. Steel screamed. The earth itself glowed faintly red. General Bradley's voice still echoed in every officer's head. "I want 3,000. It wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum. 12 days. No factories, no schematics. Just scavenged iron from beaches littered with the ghosts of D-Day. The first convoys rolled in before dawn on July 14th. Trucks dragged German Czech hedgehogs, those twisted, cruciform, anti-landing barriers, out of the sand. They came in hundreds, corroded by salt and fire, slick with rust and blood. Each one weighed close to a ton. Soldiers used cables, chains, and pure willpower to move them. The sound of metal clashing against truck beds carried for miles, a grim new rhythm to a tired war. At the center of that chaos stood Sergeant Curtis Grubb Cullen, the man with the burns on his hands and the idea no one dared call crazy anymore. He directed teams with a piece of chalk in one hand and a cigarette in the other, marking each hedgehog like a surgeon, outlining where to cut. He didn't shout much. He didn't need to. Every man knew the stakes. Cullen's plan was brutal in its simplicity. Cut, weld, bolt, repeat. Each hedgehog would yield 4 beams, each beam sharpened to a point, each point turned into a tusk for a Sherman tank. The design was ugly, improvised, and perfect. The 52nd Ordnance Group, commanded by Captain James Doherty, took charge of production. 30 welders, 6 cutting torches, 2 generators that coughed black smoke into the sky. The math was merciless. 3,000 tanks, 12 days, 10 per hour, 1 every 6 minutes. Even God would have needed a factory. They started cutting at sunrise. Torches hissed and spat. The German steel glowed white-hot, then cooled, slower than expected, warping blades and frying torch tips. Within 20 minutes, the nozzles overheated and failed. Men dunked them in barrels of water that hissed like snakes. Steam rose around them, mixing with the sweat and diesel fumes. By midnight, they had finished 8 devices. 8 out of 3,000. At that rate, they'd finish in October. Operation Cobra would come and go. The Germans would still own Normandy. Cullen didn't curse. He analyzed. He studied the cooling cycle, the torch angle, the airflow through the regulators. He spotted the pattern. The heat wasn't dissipating fast enough. The answer wasn't strength, it was rhythm. One team worked while another rested their torches. One cut, one cooled, one welded, like breathing. By morning, production doubled, then tripled. Still nowhere near enough. Cullen worked 20 hours a day, his fingertips split. His voice turned to gravel from shouting over generators. Doherty brought in 40 more welders from every nearby battalion, men who'd fixed tanks in the field, now fixing the field itself. The site became an industrial symphony, hammering, grinding, shouting. Floodlights stabbed through the fog. The night sky shimmered orange. From a distance, it looked like an army forging its own dawn. On July 15th, production reached 22 devices per day. By July 17th, 38. Still hopeless numbers against the clock, but momentum had begun. Every morning the men lined up, faces grey with exhaustion and dust, waiting for Cullen's briefings. His words were short, sharp, fed by belief more than sleep. Reinforce the mount, don't rush the weld. One bad seam kills a tank crew. By day 4, new problems appeared. Each 4-prong assembly weighed 320 pounds, shifting a Sherman's center of gravity forward by 6 inches. After several test runs, the front suspension on 3 tanks cracked under stress. The shock from ramming centuries-old earth could cripple the vehicle. Cullen solved it the same way. He solved everything through sheer, stubborn logic. He added reinforcement brackets that distributed the weight across the hull's internal frame. It took 30 extra minutes per tank, but prevented breakage. Another small victory carved out of fatigue. By July 19th, the team had completed roughly 400 devices. Only 2,600 to go. 6 days left. Bradley's headquarters sent another message, one that felt like a knife. Minimum requirement: 2,000 Rhino tanks before Cobra, otherwise delay offensive. Delay wasn't an option. The men at the front were bleeding for every inch of hedgerow. The Germans were digging deeper. Every day of waiting meant hundreds of new graves. Cullen's eyes had turned bloodshot. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours in 3 days. He walked like a man running on fumes and adrenaline, hands bandaged, uniform scorched, but his voice never broke. He drove the welders harder, reorganized them into rotating 12-hour shifts, called in recovery crews from inactive units. Anyone with a cutting torch became part of the miracle. By July 21st, 15 new welding stations had joined the line. Output jumped to 112 devices per day. The field had become a factory. Rows of Shermans waited like prehistoric beasts ready for horns. Sparks flew through night air thick with the smell of molten flux. Men worked shirtless, silhouettes lit by fire, faces set in grim determination. They weren't fighting Germans now, they were fighting time. "Rhinos," one soldier muttered, watching a tank roll off the line with its 4 steel tusks. "Ugly bastards." "Ugly's fine," another said. "Ugly kills hedges." By July 22nd, production passed 1,200. The number felt unreal, steel transformed by desperation into salvation. But that same night, the steel itself began to vanish. Every hedgehog from Omaha and Utah had been melted, cut, or hauled inland. The beaches were bare, the scrapyards empty. Doherty's logistics team reported the shortage like a death sentence. Without raw material, the line would stop within 24 hours. Bradley's staff demanded options. Cullen didn't wait for permission. He walked to the edge of the site, staring at the railway that cut across the valley. The solution stood right there, railroad tracks. Softer than German steel, yes, but plentiful and thick enough to bite earth. He ordered recovery crews to start cutting rail lines from abandoned junctions. Within hours, flatbeds rolled in carrying piles of iron. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. The Green Dozer variant, named after Lieutenant Charles Green, the first man to ram a hedge, was born. Heavier, cruder, slower, but effective. By July 23rd, the numbers finally made sense. 1,800 rhinos ready, 500 more in progress. A total of 2,300 tanks, not the perfect 3,000 Bradley wanted, but enough to break Hell's Gate. That night, Cullen stood by the edge of the production field, the air still trembling with heat. He watched column after column of Shermans roll out towards staging zones near Marigny. Each one bore its new armor, steel tusks, glinting under floodlights. They looked absurd, beautiful, terrifying. A corporal walked by, carrying a toolbox, and said, "You think it'll work, Sarge?" Cullen exhaled through smoke. "We'll find out in 2 days." The men didn't talk much after that. They just worked. 12 days of exhaustion forged into one collective heartbeat. Cullen's body was failing, fingers blistered, lungs coated in metal dust, but his mind kept moving. He'd solved the heat problem, the suspension problem, the material shortage. Now he faced the unknown. Would the Rhino survive a real battlefield? Would the welds hold under artillery fire? Would they break against the first hedge with a stone base? He didn't know, but he knew one thing: they had run out of time to wonder. The last day of production felt like judgment. Rain poured from a grey sky, hissing against the torches. The men kept working, water and sparks mingling like oil and fire. When the final tank rolled off the line, Cullen simply nodded. The job was done. The tanks gathered on the open plain outside Colombières, hundreds of them lined nose to nose. The air buzzed with engines idling, treads clanking, steel tusks shining through the mist. The sight was something between a nightmare and a prophecy. Cullen wiped his hands on his uniform and stared at the horizon. The hedgerows weighted 12 feet of earth and root that had killed 400 tanks and stopped an army for 6 weeks. But this time, the walls of Normandy would meet something new. 1,000 machines built from enemy steel, welded by exhaustion and fed by belief. He turned away from the line of tanks, walked back toward the dying glow of the field, and said quietly to no one in particular, "Let's see if they hold." The rain fell harder. Engines roared to life. The rhinos began to move, dragging dust, hauling blades, carrying the faith of men who'd burned their hands to make them. Operation Cobra was 2 days away. And for the first time, the soldiers of the First Army looked at those armored beasts and believed the impossible might just be possible. Rain came down in sheets that hissed against molten steel. It mixed with smoke, grease, and sweat until the whole field smelled like metal and thunder. The ground trembled with the rhythm of hammers, the hiss of torches, the low growl of engines idling through the night. The forge of Colombières had come alive, a place where exhaustion met faith, and faith was fed by fire. General Bradley's impossible order still hung in the air like scripture. 3,000 rhinos in 12 days. It was not strategy anymore. It was prophecy. Men repeated it between clenched teeth, half curse, half battle cry. Cullen stood in the center of it all, blackened hands wrapped in rags, his uniform burned through in places from falling sparks. He had become the gravity of the operation. Everything orbited him. He walked from one tank to the next, inspecting every seam with his fingertips, feeling for weakness, murmuring corrections to the welders over the roar of acetylene. "No weak lines," he said. "A bad weld kills a crew." They listened. Nobody argued. The men trusted him the way men in foxholes trust the ground beneath them, because if it gives way, everything is lost. The first few days were a war against physics. German steel wasn't meant to be cut. It was dense, cold, and uncooperative. Cutting torches overheated after 20 minutes, burning out their nozzles. Men had to rotate tools like soldiers, changing rifles in the middle of a firefight. The first night yielded only 8 finished cutters. The second day, 22. The numbers were hopeless. Cullen didn't sleep. He mapped the process in chalk on a wooden crate cut. Cool, weld, rotate. He saw the flaw, heat build-up, so he reorganized the shifts. One team cut, while another cooled torches in water barrels. The third team welded. Then they switched, the rhythm steadied. Production doubled, then tripled. Still, it wasn't enough. On July 17th, Captain Doherty arrived, with 40 more welders pulled from every maintenance battalion in Normandy. Men who used to patch bullet holes in tank armor now joined the line. The sight expanded, rows of Shermans waiting under tarps, mountains of cut steel stacked beside them. The floodlights bathed everything in white smoke. It looked like an inferno frozen in motion. By the 4th day, they had 38 devices complete. The rain turned the ground into black soup, swallowing boots with every step. Cullen's voice rasped from shouting over generators. He moved like a ghost through firelight, pointing, correcting, lifting. More angle, he'd say. Tighten the weld line. Reinforce that bracket. Every order came clipped, fast, final. Then came a new problem. Each 4-prong assembly weighed 320 pounds. When bolted to the Sherman's bow, it pulled the tank's nose down 6 inches. After 2 test runs, 3 tanks came back with cracked suspension springs. The armor held, but the heart of the machine broke. Cullen crawled under one of the damaged tanks himself, mud up to his elbows, flashlight clamped in his teeth. He studied the fractures, ran his hands along the metal's edge. The answer came in silence. Distribute the weight. He drew a new design on the tank's side, with chalk reinforcement brackets that tied the tusks into the hull frame. It added half an hour per build, but saved the suspension. The next day, they tested the fix. No cracks. By July 19th, the scoreboard hit 400 finished Rhinos. 2,600 left. The clock screamed louder. Bradley's headquarters sent a new message. Minimum 2,000 Rhinos. By July 25th or delay, Operation Cobra. Delay meant disaster. Every day in the bocage was another 100 dead men, another column of burning Shermans. Cullen didn't need to read the telegram twice. He went straight back to work. He requested 15 more welding stations. Doherty made it happen. They cannibalized equipment from repair depots, even borrowed torches from units still fighting near Saint-Lô. Mechanics became manufacturers overnight. They worked in 12-hour shifts, some men sleeping on the ground between tanks, faces streaked with soot and rainwater. By July 21st, 15 new stations roared to life. Sparks filled the sky like fireflies from hell. The field glowed orange all night, an island of noise and fury in a black sea of rain. Output jumped to 112 devices per day. For the first time, the numbers gave hope. Someone started calling it the 12-day miracle. The name spread through the camp, whispered half in pride, half in disbelief. The miracle had a smell burned oil and hot iron, and a sound the hiss of torches cutting through fear. But the miracle was bleeding resources. By July 22nd, every scrap of German steel from Omaha to Utah Beach was gone. The piles of hedgehogs had been stripped to nothing but rusted bolts. Doherty's logistics men reported the shortage like a death sentence. No steel, no Rhinos. Cullen stared at the empty pile of beach obstacles, jaw tight. Then his eyes drifted to the railway that ran along the horizon. Rail lines, miles of them. Softer metal, yes, but plentiful. He made the call without hesitation. Tear up the tracks. By midnight, soldiers were out in the rain, prying iron rails from the ground with crowbars and cutting them into sections. Flatbeds arrived at dawn, carrying jagged beams, still dripping mud. The welders cursed at the impurities but worked anyway. A new variant was born, the green dozer, heavier and cruder but strong enough to crush the bocage. On July 23rd, the counters hit 1,000. 800 rhinos ready and 500 more in progress. 2 days left. 2 days to finish what an entire army had deemed impossible. Cullen stood at the edge of the field, soaked through, watching the tanks roll out one after another. They didn't look like machines anymore. They looked like beasts, tusked and breathing steam. Floodlights gleamed off wet metal, turning them into silhouettes of myth. The soldiers who drove them didn't cheer. They just nodded. They understood. That night, the rain turned from drizzle to storm. The field became a sea of mud. Still, the torches hissed. Sparks flew upward like stars, refusing to die. No one stopped. At dawn, the last cutter cooled. The line was silent except for the hiss of rain and the rumble of distant artillery. Cullen stood by the final Rhino, ran his hand over its prongs, and said nothing. The tanks were ready, 2,000, 300 of them armed with tusks, fed by exhaustion, powered by faith. It wasn't 3,000, but it was enough. Enough to tear through a continent of earth and doubt. Engines growled to life. The first columns rolled toward their assembly points near Marigny. The earth shook as hundreds of steel giants moved together. The sound wasn't mechanical, it was alive, a heartbeat made of iron. Cullen didn't smile. He just watched. The smoke from the torches drifted over the departing tanks like a farewell. The field was littered with burnt scraps, broken blades, and empty barrels, remnants of a miracle. A corporal nearby lit a cigarette and said quietly, "You think they'll hold, Sarge?" Cullen's voice came low. "They'd better. We're out of time." He turned toward the horizon. Somewhere out there lay the bocage, those 12-foot walls that had stopped the First Army cold for 6 weeks. In 2 days, the rhinos would charge them head-on. Behind him, the production site fell silent for the first time in 12 days. The men stood there, soaking wet, exhausted, but alive. They had done something no one believed possible. They had taken the enemy's steel and forged it into their own salvation. And now the fate of the breakout rested on their hands, on their welds, on their faith. The rain kept falling, washing away the grime but not the resolve. The next sound they would hear would not be torches. It would be the roar of engines charging through the walls of Normandy. Operation Cobra was 48 hours away. The miracle was finished. The test had yet to begin. Dawn rose behind a curtain of smoke. The ground near Saint-Lô shook like an engine about to seize. At 6:11 a.m., July 25th, 1944, 3,000 Allied aircraft tore through the grey sky and dropped 4,000 tons of explosives onto the German lines. The air became fire. The sky itself seemed to burn. The earth convulsed, fields, trees, and villages vanished under a storm of steel. It was not bombardment. It was rebirth through destruction. Inside his observation post, 3 miles behind the line, Sergeant Curtis Cullen watched the horizon flicker. The sky turned white, then black, then orange. Each explosion sent a pressure wave rolling through the ground like a pulse through a living thing. The air tasted of dirt and cordite. And when the bombardment finally stopped 90 minutes later, the silence was obscene. Somewhere out there, waiting at the edge of the shattered bocage, stood 2,300 Rhino tanks, each one armed with Cullen's crude, beautiful invention. 4 steel tusks scavenged from enemy iron. Their engines idled low, feeding on diesel and belief. At 7:45 a.m., the first order came down the radio: "Advance." Engines roared. The steel herd moved. Treads churned mud. dragging dust and shredded branches. The tanks rolled forward into a world still shaking from the bombs. The first hedgerow loomed a 12-foot wall of earth and roots, the same kind that had swallowed Sherman's whole for 6 weeks. The lead tank from Company B, 2nd Armored Division, accelerated to 25 miles per hour. Its rhino tusks glinted under the Sunday. The driver didn't flinch. The tank hit the wall like a freight train. The sound was not explosion, but impact, a solid, bone-deep crack as steel met 5 centuries of earth. The prongs dug in, the nose dipped. For 3 long seconds, nothing happened. Then, with a scream of gears and tearing roots, the wall collapsed inward. The Sherman burst through the other side, dragging chunks of Normandy behind it. 16 seconds. That's how long it took to break a problem that had killed thousands. Radio chatter erupted. Breach successful. No suspension damage. Device intact. Across the entire front, tanks began punching through hedgerows that had once been unbreakable. Company C reported 3 breaches in 20 minutes. Company A smashed through 5 consecutive walls without stopping. German positions collapsed like dominoes. Their entire doctrine, based on ambushing tanks as they climbed over hedgerows, was suddenly useless. They had aimed for bellies. Now there were no bellies to hit. The Germans fired high, too late. Panzerfausts slammed into dirt instead of armor. Anti-tank guns missed their marks. Infantry scattered. By 10:30 a.m., the 2nd Armored Division had advanced 2 miles. Normally, that took 3 days. At 11, reports of failures came in. Not many, but enough to remind everyone that perfection never survives contact with war. A Sherman from the 741st Battalion struck a hedgerow with a buried stone foundation. The prongs bent backward. The tank stalled, stuck halfway through. Machine gunfire pinned the crew. 2 men died climbing out. At 11:20, a light tank's tusks broke off after hitting a hidden fence post. Another at noon rammed too fast, 30 miles per hour, snapping its mounting brackets. The right track jammed. The crew escaped, shaken but alive. The failure rate was 4%. 4 out of every 100 breaches. 96 worked, 4 didn't. Cullen listened to each report in silence. He did the math in his head. 4% of 2,300, 92 tanks, 460 men. He didn't speak. He just stared at the map. But the advance didn't stop. By 1:30 p.m., a battalion from the 3rd Armored Division radioed in, "We've reached the Marigny Street-Gilles Road. 4 miles inland in 6 hours. That same distance had taken 2 weeks in June. The impossible was happening. The Bocage, the ancient green fortress of Normandy, was crumbling beneath American steel. By 3 p.m., the line broke wide open. The German front, once a labyrinth of defensive lanes, was now a scatter of fleeing units. Tanks rolled through gaps that didn't exist yesterday. Infantry followed, weapons raised, boots splashing through the churned mud. Radio operators couldn't keep up. The front was moving faster than maps could track. At 4:15 p.m., General Omar Bradley's headquarters sent the message that every man had waited for. Operation Cobra succeeding beyond projections. Rhino tanks have solved the Bocage problem. The words spread like wildfire. Mechanics who'd welded those prongs in the mud looked at each other in disbelief. They had done it. Their scrap steel miracle worked. Cullen didn't cheer. He didn't celebrate. He just kept listening to the reports, writing down numbers, making notes of failures. The math still mattered to him. 92 tanks broken, 460 men gone, 4%. But against that, 14,000 soldiers were alive who might have died otherwise. 4% felt small next to survival. As the sun dropped behind the blackened horizon, the field around Saint-Lô was unrecognizable. The hedgerows, those walls that had defined Normandy for centuries, were ripped open. Earth and roots hung in the air like open veins. The tanks moved faster now, their tracks grinding over soil that no longer fought back. Cullen left the observation post at 5. He drove alone in a jeep along the dirt road toward the production field at Colombières. The sky glowed faintly red from artillery in the distance. The welding site was empty now, silent except for the wind-rattling cut steel scraps. Torches lay cold, their tips blackened. He parked, got out, and sat on the hood. For the first time in weeks, he heard nothing but the faint echo of war far away. The miracle had left this place behind. He tried to absorb it all. 3 weeks ago, he had drawn the device on a ration box. 2 weeks ago, they'd called him reckless. 12 days ago, the men had built an army of steel from German trash. Now that same trash was tearing through France, dragging the whole war forward. He looked at his hands burned, blistered, wrapped in dirty bandages. He thought about the welders who had worked through the rain, about Doherty shouting orders over the generators, about the nameless mechanics who slept beside their torches. Every one of them had left a fingerprint on history. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the rhinos were still moving, cutting through fields, through forests, through fear itself. By July 26th, the momentum was unstoppable. The First Army moved 8 miles in one day. 8 miles after 6 weeks of crawling, German commanders panicked. Their defensive network, built on the belief that the bocage was impregnable, had turned to dust. Captured officers called the Rhino tanks hedgehogs of iron, hedgevilles. Some refused to fight them, claiming the Americans had built machines from hell itself. Bradley's staff calculated the results. Tank losses dropped by 37%, crew casualties by 1,500 men. The advance was faster than any projection. Normandy was opening up, and with it, the road to Paris. But Cullen didn't see numbers. He saw faces. The men who lived, the men who didn't. The 4% who burned inside their machines. He stayed quiet about it. To others, he was a hero now, a sergeant who had solved a problem that had stopped an army. But he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had borrowed time and paid in scars. When night came, he sat outside his tent, listening to distant engines rumbling through the dark. He knew they were his engines, his creation, hauling blades through the soil. He wondered if the welds were holding. He wondered how many were breaking. War didn't stop for inventors. It used them, burned them, then moved on. Yet somewhere inside, a flicker of something remained: pride, maybe, or peace. He thought of the welders back in that rain-soaked field, sparks flying against the night, hands blackened, eyes burning with fatigue. They had built something out of nothing. They had proven that ingenuity could be louder than artillery. The next morning, July 27th, reports came in from every direction. The 2nd Armored had reached Coutances. The 3rd Armored was pushing past Marigny. The 1st Infantry had broken the German counterattack at Mortain. The wall of Normandy had fallen. Bradley sent out a field-wide commendation praising the Rhino tanks and the men of steel who built them. He mentioned Cullen by name. Word spread through every division. Cullen never read it. He was already on the road, inspecting a repair site where damaged rhinos were being patched and sent back into battle. The war still needed fixing. There was always another seam to weld, another wall to break. He stood by a tank that had come back from the front, tusks bent, armor scarred, but still running. He touched the prongs. They were warm to the touch, alive with friction and dust. The soldier beside him grinned. "This thing went through 6 hedges, Sarge. Didn't even slow down." Cullen smiled faintly, then welded again. That night, as the last light faded over the French countryside, he watched the rhinos move again, columns of steel dragging the dust behind them, engines humming in rhythm. The light from their exhausts flickered against the torn earth, like candles marking a trail through darkness. The hedgerows were gone. The bocage was broken. Normandy was breathing again. And somewhere between the silence of the ruined fields and the roar of advancing tanks, the war itself had changed. Because in those 12 days of mud and fire, one man's idea, born from scavenged steel and stubborn faith, had turned the tide of a continent. The road ahead led to Paris. But for Cullen, it led somewhere quieter toward reflection and the long shadow of what it meant to create something that saved lives by breaking everything in its path. He didn't know it yet, but the next chapter was already forming the reckoning that comes after victory. The hedgerows were gone. Normandy, once a maze of dirt and roots that swallowed men whole, now stretched open like a scar under grey skies. The road to Paris had begun. By July 28, 1944, the First Army was moving faster than its own maps could be updated. Tanks thundered through the countryside, supply trucks trailed behind in clouds of dust, and for the first time since D-Day, the word momentum meant hope. Entire German divisions were folding, their defenses crumbling like clay in the rain. And behind that movement, hidden in the noise of engines and victory, was the hand of one sergeant from Cranford, New Jersey, a man who had welded a solution out of wreckage and belief. In the silence after the storm, the land told its story in ruins. The bocage was shattered, burned-out tanks lay half-buried in the mud. The hedgerows that had once been walls of death were now jagged mounds of earth, torn open by American steel. Sergeant Curtis Cullen rode past them in a jeep with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, the unit he had started with before anyone knew his name. He didn't speak, he just looked. Everywhere he turned, his invention followed him. Rhino tanks with bent tusks, scorched hulls, and mud still clinging to their prongs like blood. Some were dead, but most were alive, still moving. The field at Colombières, once a forge of desperation, had turned into a repair depot. Welders straightened twisted blades, mechanics patched brackets, and the air still carried the smell of burned flux. The U.S. Army had turned Cullen's chalk sketch into a document, Technical Bulletin TBR 231, Hedgerow Cutting Device M1, Cullen type. It looked cold on paper, a string of instructions stripped of sweat and fire. But inside every line was the sound of torches cutting through rain. From that moment, the Rhino was no longer an idea. It was official doctrine. Cullen didn't help write the manual. He didn't care for titles or credit. He cared about movement. He'd built something that worked, and that was enough. Operation Cobra rolled into legend. Patton's Third Army entered the fight, and 500 Rhinos were assigned to his divisions. They tore through Brittany, smashing the last hedgerows like they were made of paper. German prisoners called them Eisenschweinen, iron pigs. The advance was relentless. Between July 25th and August 5th, the First Army moved farther than it had in the previous 6 weeks combined. Tank losses dropped by 37%. 1,400 crews that might have died were still alive. When Cullen heard the statistics, he didn't smile. He only said, "Then it worked." He rode with his men as they pushed north toward Avranches, where the fields opened into the French plains. The Rhino prongs began to disappear. Some crews cut them off to save fuel, others stored them in depots. The war had moved beyond hedges, but not beyond memory. Soldiers began painting words on their tanks: Cullen's Teeth, Hedgebusters, Rhino Company. The crude steel blades had become something sacred, proof that a handful of men with fire and courage could change the course of a war. On August 20th, 1944, the noise of engines gave way to applause. A small clearing near Saint-Lô filled with officers, mechanics, and tank crews. General Omar Bradley stood at the front, his voice steady as always. Before him, grease-stained and bone-tired, stood Sergeant Curtis Cullen. Bradley pinned the Legion of Merit to his chest and said, "For exceptionally meritorious conduct in the development of the hedgerow cutting device, which directly contributed to the success of Operation Cobra and saved an estimated 1,500 American lives." Cullen stood stiff, unsure how to react. Medals were for heroes, not welders. But he looked at the faces in the crowd, the men who had built beside him, who had burned their hands to make steel obey, and he understood the moment wasn't his alone. After the ceremony, Lieutenant Charles Green, the first man to test the Rhino under fire, walked up and gripped his hand. "We breached 47 hedgerows, Sarge," Green said. "Didn't lose a single man." Cullen nodded once. The numbers in his head didn't stop running. 4% failure rate. 92 tanks gone, 460 men lost. War always kept its tax. By September, the Rhinos were fading into history, even as the war pushed east. Patton's columns raced toward the German border. Paris was free. Tanks rolled across bridges instead of hedgerows. The prongs that had once saved them now slowed them down. Crews unbolted them, stacking them like relics of another world. But doctrine endured. The Armored Force Board at Fort Knox studied the device, labeling it a model of field improvisation. Training manuals were rewritten. FM 17-33 added a new line: approach hedgerow base at 25 miles per hour. Maintain pressure for 15 seconds. Breach and advance. What had started in mud became a rule carved into American strategy. Across the ocean, the British 21st Army Group built their own. The Canadians followed. Even Soviet advisors studied the design. In every army, one lesson echoed: adapt or die. And in that lesson was Cullen's signature, burned into history without his consent. When the war ended in May 1945, Cullen came home, a soldier with calloused hands and a medal he didn't talk about. He married Bernice Enright, moved to New York, and worked at Shenley Industries, a liquor company. His days were simple paperwork, coffee, quiet streets, no torches, no engines, just the hum of civilian life trying to drown out the echoes of Normandy. Reporters came and went. He gave short answers. When asked if he felt like a hero, he said, "We all broke the walls. I just started the cut." But history had other plans. In 1951, Omar Bradley published A Soldier's Story. One line resurrected Cullen's name. Cullen's device was so absurdly simple it had baffled an army for 6 weeks. The words spread. Military academies quoted them. Fort Knox dedicated a Sherman to him, Rhino prongs still welded to its bow. Officer candidates at West Point studied the Cullen principle that innovation doesn't need permission. The man himself stayed away. He didn't visit museums or give lectures. He'd done his part. He wanted peace, not applause. He died in 1963, quietly, in a small apartment in Greenwich Village. The obituary was short: his rank, his medal, his invention. But history was not finished speaking. A year later, President Dwight Eisenhower, in a television interview with Walter Cronkite on the 20th anniversary of D-Day, told the story of the hedgerow cutters. He named Cullen directly. "That sergeant's device," Eisenhower said, "was the key to breaking out of Normandy." Millions heard it. For a moment, across living rooms in America, the name Curtis Cullen stood shoulder to shoulder with generals. The recognition came too late for him to see, but the echo carried. The Army formalized the device into legend. Museums displayed it. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans set up a Rhino tank, steel tusks glinting under spotlights. A placard read, "Built from German beach obstacles by Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, used in Operation Cobra, July 1944. Thousands of visitors passed by, few realizing they were looking at one man's defiance turned into doctrine. His legacy lived on in silence and sparks. Decades later, soldiers in Iraq welded scrap metal onto Humvees for armor. Engineers in Afghanistan reinforced mine-resistant vehicles with field modifications. Every act of battlefield improvisation traced its bloodline back to that muddy field in Normandy, where ordinary men refused to stop building even as shells fell around them. Cullen's invention was never about metal. It was about mindset, a belief that the impossible could be cut through, welded apart, and reshaped. The Rhino wasn't just a machine, it was a declaration. If you visit Normandy today, the hedgerows still stand. The roots twist deep into the earth, ancient and quiet. But scattered among them are fragments of prongs, steel rusted by 80 years of rain. The museums call them artifacts. The veterans called them lifelines. Walk through the American cemeteries nearby. The marble crosses line up in silence, bright against the green hills. Somewhere among those names are the men who drove the first Rhinos, who believed in a sergeant's sketch scrawled on a ration box. 1,500 of their brothers came home because of it. 1,500 sons, fathers, husbands. That is the measure of one man's idea, not the medal, not the doctrine, lives. Curtis Cullen never called himself an inventor. He never saw himself as a hero. He was a soldier who saw a problem and refused to accept it. And that refusal, that stubborn, ordinary courage, is what changes history. Because war is built on walls, and history belongs to the ones who find a way through them. When the world built walls of earth in Normandy, he built steel to cut them open. When everyone else saw obstacles, he saw opportunity. When time was running out, he built time itself. And that is how a man from Cranford, New Jersey, armed with nothing but scrap metal and will, carved a road through the hedgerows of France and into the immortal heart of history.